He survived secret CIA plots, undercover mafia assassination attempts, and even the threat of nuclear annihilation.
The weapons of war must be abolished.
He turned Cuba from a colonial paradise into a player on the world stage.
Our troubles in this hemisphere are being generated by Castro's Cuba.
This is the story of Fidel Castro, a communist icon who's ruled Cuba for half a century. A dictator only 90 miles from US shores, who's outlasted 9 American presidents. This is Castro, Declassified.
Cuban sugar, Cuban water, Cuban electricity, Cuban telephones. The entire economic infrastructure of the island gradually was bought up or invested in by American capital. And this, of course, laid the groundwork for a great deal of nationalist sentiment in Cuba.
This was the Cuba that Castro grew up in the 1930s and 1940s. 1952. With corruption in the government rampant, a young Fidel Castro decided to run for Congress under a clean government party banner. But just before Election Day, the self-appointed chief of the military, Fulgencio Batista, cancelled the elections, pushed out the Cuban president Carlos Prios Socorras in a bloodless coup, and took control of the island republic. Corruption increased. On the 26th of July 1953, Castro made a reckless, radical move. He led a group of about 150 men to storm one of the biggest military garrisons in Cuba, the Moncada barracks at Santiago de Cuba, on the eastern side of the island. The goal was to seize enough arms to mount a military revolution. The result was a bloodbath.
They failed miserably. Many of them died. Those that weren't killed were sent to jail.
From prison, Castro produced a manuscript of his words, "History will absolve me." With public opinion firmly in his favor, and thanks to pleas from Castro's politically connected family, he and others were released in an amnesty after serving less than 2 years. But informed of Batista's plans to have him killed after his release, Castro fled to Mexico to plot his next move. On the 26th of November 1956, Castro returned from Mexico on a leaky old boat called the Granma with a few dozen men. On the 2nd of December, they were ambushed by the Cuban army. Most of them were killed outright. Castro survived, and with a handful of others, escaped to the Sierra Maestra Mountains.
In mid-1958, Batista makes the decision to launch a general offensive, over 10,000 troops, tanks, motorized equipment, against Castro's forces in eastern Cuba.
Among the growing band of revolutionaries with Castro in the mountains was a young Argentine destined to become the world's most recognized revolutionary, Ernesto Che Guevara.
The equipment gets stuck in the mud. It's the middle of the rainy season. These are unprofessional soldiers. The soldiers, many of them, do not want to fight. The general offensive is a disaster. Troops retreat. Many surrender. And from mid-1958 to December, what you see is the armed forces of the Republic of Cuba collapse.
Throughout Cuba, people were becoming more and more repulsed by the brutality of the Batista regime. In his attempt to hold on to power, he jailed and killed thousands. The tighter he squeezed, the more his power slipped away. Fidel Castro's opportunity had arrived. Like everyone else, President Fulgencio Batista celebrated at midnight. But for him, time had run out.
He gathers together on New Year's Eve after an appropriately festive party. His buddies, political, military, and other social leaders, fills about 6 airplanes and leaves the country.
The nation celebrated. People danced in the streets, filled with hope for a new beginning, a new Cuba. Castro took several days to enter Havana, driving across the country, rallying seas of people to his side. By the time he arrived in Havana, 1 million people had taken to the streets to celebrate a victory they saw as their own, and to hear Castro speak. But for the US government, Castro was far from a savior. Although Castro met Vice President Nixon and appeared in several interviews on US television, the period of goodwill was brief.